Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to a Victober video. I'm so excited. It's finally that time of year. I wanted to kind of kick off Victober this year with a few recommendation videos. I wanted to kind of intersperse these throughout the month where I just kind of give a few, around five was my goal, just 5 recommendations of books that fit under kind of a certain category. I wanted to kick off this series of Victorian recommendations with short reads because the readathon is just now starting. You might be looking for a couple of extra things that you want to throw in, and I think it's always great to have kind of a short book around that you know will be an easy win and that you can get through pretty quickly. When we think about the Victorian period, I know we tend to think of the big, long beasts. I mean, books that are over 500 pages. And it's gotten to the point now in my journey with Victorian literature, when I see a book is only 500 or 600 pages, it almost qualifies for me as a shorter Victorian novel. But there are actually quite a few novels that really just are pithy, get their point across very quickly, and they tend to be under 200 pages. So I picked 5 of my favorites here. A couple of these are hard sells for me, but I really have what we'll call Goldilocks syndrome when it comes to page length. I don't like a book that is too short, but I also don't like a book that is too long. And there is a sweet spot there in the middle for me that a lot of Victorian novels hit, but these books are very short. In some of these cases, I honestly wish they were longer, but in others, I really think that the page length they had was all they needed, and it just wound up being a perfect experience. So there are a couple of 5 stars here from me. But let's go on and get into my list. I think I have 5 here. And the first of these that I'm going to recommend is a perennial favorite. It is a Victober favorite, certainly, and it's one of my favorite books of all time. In fact, I reread it last year for Victober. That is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I think honestly, when I'm sitting here looking at my stack, this very well might be the longest book that I have to recommend today, and it comes in at a little over 200 pages, but I still think it's possibly the longest of the ones that I have to recommend here. This is a really great one for this time of year in particular. It feels like a really great autumn recommendation, but it's also very decadent and very beautifully written. I don't feel like you're sacrificing anything here by reading a shorter book. It does feel as though, based on his language and the plot, the conversations that are happening between the characters, that you're still getting like a 500-page novel in 200 pages. This is one of the few books that I feel as though I had no critiques for. I don't really see how this book could be improved. It's just one of my favorites of all time, and it was, in fact, one of the first Victorian novels that I ever read, and I think it's a great place to start if you're not all that familiar with Victorian novels. I think short Victorian novels can be a great gateway into the bigger ones. This is definitely my highest recommend of the short works that I'm going to talk about today, because I feel like this is one that everyone is at least vaguely familiar with. So you go into this with some sort of knowledge of the plot, and that can also really aid you when you're starting out in Victorian classics. This is most certainly my favorite short Victorian classic. Next, I wanted to recommend The Warden by Anthony Trollope. This is unfortunately the only Anthony Trollope book that I have ever read, but I really enjoyed it. I will say that I started trying to read this in Victober one year, and I DNF'd it because I was rather bored, but I came back to it later when I was in the mood for a quieter story, and it really worked for me. So I would say this one is a little bit quieter than some other Victorian novels. It's not heavy on the plot. It's very small town vibes, and I think it works very well in the springtime. This feels like a really wonderful spring read. This is the first in one of Anthony Trollope's series, and it often ranks as like the worst of that series. It seems like this is the one that people tend to say they don't enjoy the most. Because I haven't carried on with the series, I don't know how I feel, but I thoroughly enjoyed this. This almost got 5 stars from me. It is a high 4-star. It really deals with a cathedral town and kind of church politicking, which is something that really appeals to me as a reader and is something that I'm very interested in. And so I can see that that might be the side of things that makes you feel like this book is boring, but I really enjoy it. I think it is just one that kind of slips under the radar, but I really enjoyed this one, and it is a high recommend from me. One that is not so high a recommend from me is a book that I didn't really enjoy, but I also didn't hate, but I feel like it needs to be included here, and that is A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I feel like any of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries could go here because they're all relatively short, and I'll say, I think in the end, that's my biggest gripe with this, is that I do think it could have been longer. I really love a Victorian mystery story. I think the thing is, with Sherlock Holmes, we have been so inundated with so many different iterations and retellings of this that you go into this and into the series in general knowing where each of the mysteries is going. You know exactly how it's going to be solved. You know who did it. And I think, for me anyway, that sucks a lot of the enjoyment out of a mystery. But these are perennial favorites for a reason, and I have heard that the rest of the series is a big improvement on A Study in Scarlet. But this one, I think, is actually the shortest of the ones that I'm going to recommend today, and it comes in at around 130 pages. So basically 100 pages less than Dorian Gray. The Warden was around 150, 160 pages. So I think this is the shortest, and I think it certainly feels like it. But if you love newer iterations of Sherlock Holmes, I think going back to the original stories can be very enjoyable. Who am I if I don't recommend a Wilkie Collins book here? There are a couple of options here for Wilkie Collins, but I feel like the one that I have the real fondness for is Jezebel's Daughter. This is a relatively short work of his. For the most part, Wilkie Collins was writing a very, very long novel. This is one of the rare exceptions. I feel like this, The Dead Secret, and a couple of others come in at around that 200-page mark. But this is a really interesting but typical Wilkie Collins story. This is about a woman who will do anything for her daughter, and it's set in Frankfurt, which I just found so much fun. I really enjoyed getting a new setting in a Victorian novel. And so there is kind of the typical mystery element here, but it's not nearly as long as some of his other works like Armadale or No Name, The Woman in White. This is a really great one. I think if you just want to get your feet wet with Wilkie Collins, I think you could easily start here. If you're just looking for another short Victorian classic, you could also just slip this one in. This is really fun, and the mystery element to it really means that it goes by very quickly as well. Not only is it a short book in general, but it's very pithy. This is, in fact, one of my favorite Wilkie Collins novels. I say that like all of them are not favorites, but this is definitely in my top 5 currently. Last but not least is a book that I know is hit or miss for people, and I know it's a controversial recommendation. This is a really popular Victorian author, and this book is one of his sleepers, I think. And I understand, truly I do, I understand the criticisms of this one, but there's just something about it for me. And that is Two on a Tower by Thomas Hardy. I misspoke. This is actually the longest of the recommendations that I have for you today, and it comes in at almost 300 pages. So it's almost just, in general, a full-length novel, but it feels very short for Thomas Hardy, so I guess that's why I immediately thought of it when I thought of short Victorian works. This is about an affair between a woman who's like 29 with a guy who's like 19. And they have this affair in an astronomy tower that they both enjoy going to look at the stars. I'm sorry, this is a really beautiful book. I have a mixed relationship with Thomas Hardy. He hits or he misses for me. This is one of his big hits. I love this book, but I do understand that it's a little bit different for him. And I understand too that because it is short, it feels like a lot happens off page. I think that's one of the main criticisms of it, which I totally understand. But this has some of Thomas Hardy's most beautiful writing. Everything relates back to the stars. The star-crossed lovers effect, the age gap romance kind of, just in general being in the astronomy tower and discussing stars and then both looking out of the telescope and like showing the other how to use the telescope to look at the stars. I'm sorry. This is a 5-star book for me, and I really, really love it. It's one of my favorite Thomas Hardy's. In fact, it might be in my top 3 Thomas Hardy novels. But this is the one I think of all 5 that is going to be the one that people dislike the most. I just feel like, based on the criticisms I've heard of this, this is just not one of his more popular works. And I kind of understand why, but this really worked for me. And so I couldn't not recommend it in a video about short Victorian classics. I could have included a few more things here, but I really wanted to keep this at a very low number, just a few. And these are a few of my favorites. I do tend to be someone who really enjoys the long, drawn-out Victorian novel, but it's always very nice to have a short book that you can interweave among these longer books in a readathon like this, or just in general throughout the year when you want a little hit of a Victorian classic. These short novels are great to have on hand. I would love to know down below if you have any recommendations for this little recommendation series. What are some recommendations that you would like to see? I think I will do kind of an equivalent to this, which is with longer Victorian novels that I really do think are worth your time. But today it was all about the short Victorian novels. So I would love to know down below if you have read any of these and if you have any recommendations on short Victorian novels. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Happy Victober. Goodbye.